Och vi fortsätter här 223b. Jag skulle precis komma in på citatet utav David Bohm som han skriver i boken Det holografiska paradigmet. I had the notion that one needs to understand the reality of the process, and that quantum mechanics gave no picture, no notion of what was happening. It merely talked about the result of measurements or observations. From such result you can compute the result, and you can compute the probability of another observation without any notion how they are connected except statistically. So you acquire a tool to make your next prediction from the mathematical calculations, and that's something you learn by heart. You need to do this to get a feeling for it, and all of a sudden you have another feeling for cause and effect. It's not anything similar to the one we have in everyday life. And in this process, Bohm wrote, "Now I try to get some idea what might be the process implied by the mathematics of quantum theory. And in this process is what I call unfoldment. The mathematic itself suggests a movement in which everything, any particular element of space, may have a field which unfolds into the world. Or it unfolds into what would be a hologram. In a photograph made by a lens, you have a point-to-point correspondence. Each point in the object corresponds to a point in the image. In a hologram, the entire object is contained in each region of the hologram, unfolded as patterns of waves, which can be unfolded by shining light through." So it's in a process of unfoldment you make a hologram, and with this hologram you can in the end unfold once again what's inside the hologram, so to speak. So it's a process of unfolding and unfolding, unfolding and unfolding. And if you look at the mathematics, David Bohm continues, of the quantum theory, it describes a movement of just this nature, a movement of waves that unfold and unfold throughout the whole of space. You could therefore say that everything is unfolded in this whole, or even in each part, and that it then unfolds. I call this an implicate order, the unfolded order, and this unfolds into an explicate order. The implicate is the unfolded order. It unfolds into explicate order in which everything is separated. So you see, with the metaphor of the droplet of ink in the glycerin, you turn the glycerin clockwise, and the water or the ink drop will be smaller, smaller and smaller. In the end it will disappear, it won't be there anymore, but if you start to turn the whole glycerin ball counterclockwise, it will slowly reappear, and it's going to be particular again. And this is exactly the trait that David Bohm wants to show for us normal people, we laymen of the world. who haven't had any access to quantum physics because we don't have any pictures. And as I said earlier, if we don't have a new picture, the old picture would linger on. We cannot just say that picture is wrong. That's not enough at all, because we need to understand how quantum physics work. And in quantum physics, the case is not that the small is completely separated from the big, and it's not the case that small things make up big things. What happens instead, it's a particular unfoldment that happens, and this particular unfoldment becomes later enfolded and becomes once more implicit. So let me try to give you an example here really quick, and it's that if you have a lot of particles and the only picture you have is you can put those together to create a big thing, you will do that because you have no other model to use for that. So you're sort of stuck in classical physics. Doesn't matter how much you deny it, you will be stuck, because this enfoldment and unfoldment can only be understood mathematically. That is until David Bohm came with this brilliant two tools of implicit and explicit, and they are correct. This is not part of something disputed theory. It's a correct analysis from layman's perspective, although the terms explicit and implicit and the Holo movement need to be learned. That's the job you had to put in to get an insight into what usually is only understandable because of the mathematics. And this also goes for the Wheeler-de Wit equation. I was stunned by it when I first heard it, and this was in '97. It was put on a blackboard with a white chalk by the professor. Did we understand it? No. It said that in quantum physics there is no room or no time as perceived in the ordinary sense. That knowledge became to me only something I repeated without having the implicit knowledge, the embodied knowledge, because I didn't have a picture for it. I had nowhere to put it. It was a special area outside all the knowledge. It could not be applied to everyday activities. It couldn't be made into my life world. Because of this, it didn't make any significant change in life. It didn't change my ontological status. It didn't change my worldview. And I even remember we were supposed to hold some mini lectures, and I chose to have a mini lecture. It was 5-10 minutes about how quantum indeterminism changed what is usually perceived to be determinism, that everything is decided from the beginning. I made my mini lecture. I think it was approved by the professor and it was liked. Nothing complicated. And later in the break I spoke to one of the attenders. I remember his name still to this day, Rickard, and he said, "Yeah, I really like your lecture, and it's an amazing subject, but I don't know how he put it, but he said, well, of course everything is determined." And here you see, until we have a picture that can be put into our mind, it needs to be an imagery. And without that imagery, the all idea is the only way you can perceive quantum physics. You can only perceive it in a classical physical way. And this was the idea with the implicate order. And this was also the idea with the book, The Holographic Paradigm. It's a pedagogical tool to help people understand quantum physics in everyday experience. And for me, it has an even greater bonus, and that bonus is that this also helps to understand why is classical physics so real. Because they share area. Both in classical physics, quantum physics, we have small objects and big objects, and they're both important to pinpoint. Both important to understand that they are there, count on them, observe them, and so forth. So that otherwise, what you could do if you learn quantum physics is say the real world is no longer real. You do that implicitly, and I think that is one of the reasons you can actually end up in the loony bin. You can end up in the balmy house if you try to put quantum physics into the ordinary world, because that's a huge mistake. You need another picture. It will always fail otherwise, I'm quite certain of that. And failed it has. None of the layman's book, except for this one, does have any chance of showing something. It will be a separated subject, something odd happen. Well, one could say, as the author of Livet med kvantfysiska glasögon, miracles can happen, but we also need to understand how those miracles are possible, because they are possible in quantum physics. But it's no good putting quantum physics into the paradigm of classical physics. It doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. It's incommensurable. It's as bad as putting candy inside a mathematical system, or mixing the rules of golf with the rules of Monopoly. It doesn't make sense. Somebody starts screaming at you, "You're on the green, you need to pay extra money." And I came to this understanding after reading Bohm like a couple of times extra, and all of a sudden it just struck me, without the picture it won't work. It will be incommensurable. So let's continue with David Bohm from the Holographic Paradigm. So I say that this movement is the basic movement suggested by quantum theory, talking about the Holo movement. The best analogy to illustrate the implicate order is the hologram, which I contrast to a photograph. Every part of the hologram contains some information about the object, which is enfolded. One may now notice that we don't need this hologram, because each part of space contains waves from everywhere, which enfolds the whole room, the whole universe, the whole of everything. In the implicate order, everything is thus internally related to everything. Everything contains everything, and only in the explicate order are things separate and relatively independent. And this is most important. I don't know how many lectures I have with a wave and what it means. And people will always perceive the wave as a water wave at sea, or a wave that is caused by radio signals, or our radio signals. It's not like that. The wave is everywhere. It doesn't have a location. And I said that a couple of times, and in the end people give in and say, "Oh yeah, Hans says the wave is everywhere." But I now realize I was the one doing a mistake. I can't ask people to accept that, to say to them the wave is everywhere. It encompasses every part of the universe at the same time. it doesn't make any sense. But it will make any sense when you start sort of in the beginning fiddling with the expressions implicate and explicate, and after a while you will understand that there is a movement in between the explicit and the implicit, and this movement is exactly the same as the movement in the ambrogram, and this movement is beyond or underneath everything. It is everywhere. It's a part of reality that we already know in some sense. In some deeper sense, it's impossible not to know it. But it needs to come up to the head. And that won't work by saying the wave is everywhere, because that's just part of something that doesn't make any sense at all. And if it doesn't make any sense, it won't go into the system. It will be outside of the system, compartmentalized somewhere else. And I think this is very similar to the discussion that was in the 70s regarding the food in the schools. Sweden, the public schooling system also provides food, lunch, and they discussed how nutrition it should be, how many vitamins it should contain, how much proteins, and this continued for some years. They perfected the lunch to make it contain all those things that little children need, and then they realized it won't do any good in the system if they don't eat it. They need to be tasty as well, and that changed late in my schooling when I was in last grade or the penultimate grade, in the 8th grade, and there was a huge difference. All of a sudden all the school children started to eat it. It's the same with quantum theory. If somebody says or you read that the wave is everywhere, it's just like a food you can't eat because it's not tasteful. It won't go into the system, and it shouldn't go into the system. It actually shouldn't go into the system. In this discussion we mentioned so many times, I now come to a conclusion that a good doctor should never have said, yes, I understood that. He shouldn't go into his system because he's in the classical system and he doesn't have a picture for this other information. And if he would say yes, he would be lying in a certain extent, or he would cause himself harm, because classical physics and quantum physics are completely incommensurable. And this is also a very good point when it comes to David Bohm. Nobody disputes this. This is undisputable things. Nobody would say that classical physics is commensurable with quantum physics. But if you know both of them, you can understand something expressed in classical terms, but that means you really have the mathematics for all of it. And you can make the translation from one system to another one. But you need to know them mathematically very strong. And it's a little bit like you're making a soup. If you get good enough of handling bouillon, you can replace the salt proportion in the soup with the bouillon by hand. You'll see how much salt it contains, and you can use that. But you can't do that in the beginning. I tried to do it in the beginning. I poured like 1/4 piece of bouillon because it looks almost like double the amount of salt. It wouldn't work. You get a soup that doesn't contain enough salt. You learn that by hand, and this is the importance of understanding the special properties of implicit. It's not exactly as explicit. The implicit knowledge can be spoken about, but it's something that is bodily. It's more like the wave. It's everywhere. Every part of the universe contains this wave, and we can perceive the wave. That's another strange thing. It's not an unperceivable wave. And depending how the wave unfolds, you will have particles. So I think part and parcel in understanding quantum theory is understand that underneath or beyond, whatever the right term is, there is a hollow movement, there is a movement, and that movement is nothing like the movement in classical physics. And that's the key of understanding how the thing works. And I'm afraid it's going to be no understanding before the hollow movement has been understood, and the hollow movement won't come until implicit and explicit is understood. And the hologram, I think, is the best model for that. The hologram is such an odd product of the world. Reminds me a bit about the Klein bottle, but the difference being in the hologram you can understand the hollow movement. That would be tough with the Klein bottle, because in a way movement is not included in the project when it comes to the Klein bottle. One can also say that you need to understand stability and movement at the same time. See, they are both having effect. And a little helpful in that area is to see that in quantum physics we have two results of the collapse of the superposition, and that is a wave and the other one is a particle. But beyond that there is a greater wave, and this wave is the enfoldment and unfoldment, invikningen och utvikningen av hollow movement. So you see here, it's a three-part structure. You can understand you need to have two firmly established, implicit, explicit, and you can then start to understand that the enfoldment and the unfoldment of the implicit and explicit, that is the hollow movement. When you got those three moving together, you can sort of slide over to another worldview. And before that phase, you cannot equal hollow movement with something else. You can't understand it from ordinary movement or make some comparison. For in this case, it won't do. It's a little bit like a Heideggerian term. Can only be understood from a context for the other terms that Heidegger created. Dasein needs have to be firmly established before you start to understand Das Man. Otherwise, Das Man would be for some reason compared with conformity or authority or just going into anonymity. That's simply not the case. That's not how it works. It's a specific thing, and you cannot either go into the Heideggerian worldview without firmly establishing things, or can't go into the Heidegger worldview using terms of everyday language that Heidegger would call ontical terms, to say that Das Man is simply wrong or something like that, which that's really confusing, and it would stop understanding of Heidegger. And here you have exactly the same thing working in Bohm's theory. You cannot equal anything until you have at least implicit and explicit. And when you understand those, you see their functioning and how they're working, then you can go to the third step, which is understand that the enfoldment and the unfoldment is the hollow movement. And then you are liberated from classical physics. And it could actually help to say that you really already have a lot of information about the wave. This wave is something you already perceive. It's impossible to live a life without having some perception of it, because that is what forms the world. It's simply just not enough with particles and objects. And although we cannot consciously admit it, it's still there. We couldn't make rational decisions without knowing the wave. And that's quite interesting as well. There's been a lot of research about that, and I won't go into that now. I think that could be an area for another lecture. But this is not a fact that anybody, for instance, at university knows. And I remember now, and I realize now, many years later, that in the classes that we had together with Kjell all those years ago, nobody understood what he was saying. This is just impossible, I realized. No understanding can come from it. What could happen, and did happen in my case, was I learned the explicit form of quantum physics, and I had a great deal of help of that in arguments and everything, and it was a necessary part. But it needs to be implicit, because if you have the implicit knowledge, you can explicate in whatever manner you want. I would say also that arguments is going to be unbeatable, because it helps to produce arguments directly, and you're not stuck with the arguments, because you know there's a bigger truth beyond, and that's the implicit truth. That goes for safety. You'll be much safer in everything you do if you widen your contact with the wave, which is reality doing its job. I think this could help a bit now, realizing it's in the educational system. I think it would make a great revolution to understand better this implicit and explicit, because the implicit explicit is not a special case. It's how the whole world works. It's taking every part in, and the thing you have nowadays in the education system is that you only look at the explicit forms. So if we transfer knowledge to Sweden in the early 19th century, or somewhere that time, we only took the explicit forms. We didn't take the body of the knowledge. And I firmly understand this. Reality is made out of a wave. And I don't want to be one of those reality fascists. But I will make an exception now and say, you have to understand reality to get knowledge. There's no compromise here. You can't get the knowledge if you only have the explicit. You can't be happy only with the verbal expression. You will only have the taint of knowledge. So this need to be understood. And I will say that the misunderstanding that is in classical physics affects things much more in the educational, the academic system we have in Sweden, much more than it does in the wave goes for everything. It's reality, and since academia and the scholarly system and art and you name it, they are all constituted of reality. So and although I hate it to be a reality fascist, I'm going to be it now, just for the heck of it. It's not something I'm going to repeat later, but we need to understand the wave is just how it is. The wave is something we perceive already. I will take a lecture later how we perceive the wave and how that informs reality, and it can take the structure of particles. But only have of the particles won't be enough to understand reality. That's just how it is. It would be your downfall if you think that. So the first thing that David Bohm does to people is let them understand it's not all about particles. And the second understanding will be that the big does not have a relation to the small, not in the sense we normally think about it, that the big is made up. The big is something completely different than the small. The small is an unfoldment, something explicit of the implicate, that is the whole. That's how it is. And that's how particles works. And that's why they are entangled. And that's why we have spooky action at a distance. That's also why you can't both determine the place of something and the weight of it, or the force of it. You can only determine one thing. Everything comes clear if the whole movement makes sense all of a sudden. It's a little bit learning quantum physics from the beginning was like learning just a bunch of words, and much later you turn up those words could be put into sentences, and you actually learn the Tibetan language or something like that. It's not a completely fair comparison, but it's a little bit like that. So we all have a lot of experience of the implicate order. The most obvious one is ordinary consciousness, in which consciousness unfolds everything that you know or see. It doesn't merely unfold the universe, but you act according to the content as well. Therefore you are internally related to the whole in the sense that you act according to the consciousness of the whole. So you see here, it's I think consciousness and intention comes into the picture here, and no longer do we need to add intention to the cosmos or the universe. And that reminds me of my friend Kjell Burman, who always added somewhere in the context when we were talking that the universe is ingrained with intention. Here's one step better. We don't no longer need to believe in intention, because in the implicate order intention comes up by itself. It's not something you postulate or need to have happening or add to reality, something outside reality. In the whole movement you see that intention is something natural in the universe. One can say that the enfolded order is a vast range of potentiality which can be unfolded. The way it is unfolded depends on many factors. The way we think, and so is among those factors. The implicate order implies mutual participation of everything with everything. No thing is complete in itself, and its full being is realized only in that participation. The implicate order provides an image of how this might take place in physics in various ways. In participation we bring out potentials which are incomplete in themselves, but it is only in the whole that the thing is complete. This makes it clear that we are not acting mechanistically, in the sense that we will be pushed or pulled by objects in the surrounding, but rather we act according to our consciousness of them. So if you are not conscious of them, you cannot act intelligently toward them. Consciousness, therefore, is really our most immediate experience of this implicate order. And this leads us into another problem of quantum physics. How is it possible that the subject is, the observer is determining the world, and we can change it by will, by consciousness, as David Bohm mentioned it as. It doesn't make sense either, and I think normally that comes to lie outside ordinary knowledge, come to be a special drawer in the bureau where you store that knowledge, and it doesn't have any effect on anything else. I think here is extremely important to realize that when you understand the Hollow movement, you also understand that the unfolding is what the particle is. And that doesn't make the world unreal. That is actually what makes the world real, the movement. Whereas in, well, all the times in the Greek period, we say the particles make the world real because they're stable. No, it's the movement to make them real, and therefore it's come to the conclusion that the Greek was stuck in unreality, because reality is not stable. Well, it's not permanent, independent things. Rather is the Hollow movement, and it's a Hollow movement you're already aware of, otherwise you wouldn't be alive today, you wouldn't be working mechanism. But what you try to do instead is, what happens instead if you don't have this understanding of how the world works, what will happen is, the more knowledge you have of the explicit things, the more you will be stuck in a perception or an idea that the world is completely motionless, like Parmenides. And that's exactly why he had that conception. But we will have it too. The more knowledge we, so to speak, add, the more educated we become, the more we become stuck. And the more we will also at the very same time misuse our bodies. It's impossible not to misuse your body and have more knowledge. And bit by bit you lose reality. This could be put, like David Bohm so eloquently puts it, ordinarily we aim for a literal picture of the world, but in fact we create the world according to our mode of participation, and we create ourselves accordingly. If we think in our present way, we will create the kind of world we have created. Then if we think in another way, we might create a different world and different people as well. And this is an excellent segue to start speaking about meaning. Here David Bohm writes, thus, at a certain stage, the child learns how to explore something that is not present to sense perception by displaying it in the imagination. We could say that the display of imagination is similar to that of the senses, in that it is based on selected information, but different in that the information comes from memory and thought rather than primarily from sense perception. Thus, as Piaget says, the imagination gives a kind of internal imitation of the appearance of an object. For example, from the sensory perception of an object as seen from one view, the imagination may enable the child to picture what it would be like when seen from another angle. Of course, he may be able to test this image by actually moving the imagined place from which he could see the other view. But before doing this, he may test what he has done internally. He may compare the image in his mind with his knowledge of similar objects. He does an internal comparison to see if its implications make sense. If they do not, the detailed content of the intention behind the display on the second view will have to alter until a satisfactory internal image is obtained. This alteration arises from a deeper level of intention, which is concerned with bringing about harmony between the detailed content of the intention behind the display and what actually appears in the imagination. In this way, there can arise an indefinite extension of inward, soma-significant and synapsomatic activity that is relatively independent of the outgoing physical action and incoming physical sensation. Such activity is roughly what is meant by the mental side of experience. And here we get an explanation about the mental side. That's another point. In ordinary physics, consciousness is nothing but something unexplainable. But here you get, once you have the terms rolling for you, you have implicit, you have explicit, you can see that the unfoldment is what makes up reality. And in this process, you get also a tool to understand what is consciousness. The inner working of consciousness all of a sudden makes sense to you. So it is possible to look at this whole process in terms of implicate or enfolded order. For as indicated earlier, all these levels of meaning enfold each other and may have a significant bearing on each other. Within this context, meaning is constantly extending and actualizing structure. It can never be complete and fixed. At the limit of what has at any moment been comprehended are always unclarities, unsatisfactory features, and failures of intention to fit what is actually displayed or what is actually done. And the yet deeper intention is to be aware of these discrepancies and to allow the whole structure to change if necessary. This will lead to a movement in which there is a constant unfoldment of still more comprehensive meanings. For instance, in the case of the failure of Newton's law, which led to Einstein's insight into new meaning for space, time and matter. And this is wildly interesting. Although Einsteinian thinking is incommensurable with Newtonian thinking, something unfolding from the implicate meaning of Newtonian thinking turn up as in Einstein's insights. This is just great. It's like extraordinary. And you see how theories can be used in a new way, and they get a new understanding, and this understanding is more comprehensive. Theories do no longer constitute some limited area of reality, and it doesn't have to be in a mind that is cut off from the rest of the world, cut off from the body, not being present, and not being understandable to any degree. And that makes a huge difference. And what we read from the book is that Bohm's formulation of the implicate order has a deep relevance not only to reconciling and going beyond the contradictions and incompatibilities of quantum physics and relativity by presenting a new notion of order, but also our understanding of consciousness and the relationship between mind and matter. And here you have a book that I only touched once. I never read it, but I hold it in my hand many years ago. And this is Paavo Pylkkänen's book Mind, Matter and the Implicate Order. And here's a quote coming from Paavo. The origin of consciousness in the Bohmian scheme is likely to be in the depths of the implicate order, rather than the interaction of mechanical elements in the explicit order. And the latter is how we usually do it, and the former is the new possibility, a possibility that wasn't here before. The idea of implicate and explicit come into doing, and all the explanations in one way or another are explained in interactions of mechanical elements. We have, of course, theory of emergence, and that comes from, for instance, Churchland. But the only thing he says, it must be like consciousness is emerging. And that's about it. No further explanation. Here you have a very sound explanation that can be understood, it can be formulated, and it comes from reality itself. And here we have an expression of the hard problem in Bohemian terms. The hard problem is Daniel Dennett's problem. The hard problem in Bohemian terms is to say that there seemed to be nothing within the explicate order that would necessitate or make possible conscious experience. Traditional philosophy of mind and neuroscience often assume that the explicate order is all there is in the physical world, while at the same time seeking to locate consciousness to the physical world. Thus, it's not surprising from the Bohemian point of view that the hard problem is too acute for this subject. The key point is that the Bohemian scheme proposes that there is more to the world than the explicit order of matter, namely the implicate order and what may be beyond that. And if conscious experience cannot be fully accounted for within the explicit order of matter, then there is no choice but to explore the role played by the implicate order and what may lie beyond it. And I would add here that the subject plays a role, and to say that within a Newtonian understanding and a Newtonian explicit order that consciousness is there somewhere, that takes away the function of the observer, because you observed it in a way that doesn't have consciousness. And the explicit information is no consciousness. And you see the problem there. When you try to add consciousness to that when you already took the position there being no consciousness, you have a problem. That problem is avoided, and it's avoided from the best sides taken from science itself. New understanding of room, time, and space that comes from the Bohemian perspective. I think that was plenty for one time, and I say thank you very much, and bye bye.